Hey there. Yeah, you read the title right. This video series will be an analytical review where we go in depth and review every Soulsborne boss. We're going to be going in chronological order, which means Demon Souls is up first. And just a heads up, I'll be wrapping up each video with my overall thoughts on the boss design of each game, what it achieved, where it fell short, and how it holds up today. But for now, intro over, boss time. The Vanguard Demon may occasionally get written off as nothing more than a simple tutorial boss that you're supposed to die against, but he's a lot more than that to me. Vanguard Demon marks the start of a long journey FromSoft took in the Souls series, and since he is a boss that most players will die to, I think he and the tutorial itself did a good job at flashing what Demon Souls is to the player. Dying is expected here, and overcoming a hard-fought battle will lead to elated emotions and valuable resources. Most bosses in the earlier games have limited moves, and the sentiment also applies here. You can almost count on one hand how many moves this guy has. His AI has such a limited quantity of moves to grab from that I must have RNG rolled the big butt slam a few times in a row. If we grab and compare this boss to FromSoftware's other tutorial bosses, I don't think this one would be near the top, and that's okay. Asylum Demon teaches you that you can run away and how plunging attacks work. Ludic's Gundyr forces new players to grow accustomed to Dark Souls 3's combat and speed. Dying to Kenichiro sets up a really engaging story for when you fight him again at Ashina Castle, and Elden Ring's tutorial boss, well, it's a reused enemy that you will see a lot in the game. All in all, I like this boss more for its history with him being the very first boss in Demon Souls, which was FromSoft's start to this new genre. I respect him dearly. Oh, and trust me, I'm a super god gamer, and I definitely beat him first try. And if any of you are curious what happens after you kill Vanguard Demon, well, you get a few rewards and Dragon God ass blasts you to the hub zone. Phalanx is the first Demon Souls boss that the player is expected to defeat. Since Demon Souls was such an experiment for FromSoft as a whole, I'll quickly get this game's boss design philosophy out of the way. Very few Demon Souls bosses are over the top, flashy, and mechanically interesting, similar to how we see in FromSoftware's newer games. Rather, Demon Souls has a lot of gimmicky bosses that force you to solve a puzzle first and rely on mechanics second. This idea played really well into FromSoftware's hands the older Demon Souls gets, and I don't really think they intentionally did this. Not all, but a fair amount of bosses in FromSoft's now older games going all the way up to Dark Souls 2 have bosses that don't do much of anything in terms of mechanics and gimmicks. All of their games, including Sekiro, will have a dud or two, but Demon Souls, Dark Souls 1 and 2 have the most duds where there's not a lot of interesting things happening. And when we talk in depth about the games that I just mentioned, I believe that Demon Souls has the least amount of interesting bosses, while simultaneously having the least amount of complete nothing burger bosses. It's in this really weird limbo that's kind of hard to describe, but I actually don't hate Demon Souls bosses even after what I just said. As time goes on, they feel a lot more unique, since they're not trying to be something that the newer games excel at and do better than Demon Souls could have ever done. And now that that's out of the way, we can talk about the Phalanx. Phalanx uses its gimmick in ways that are still somewhat interesting even by today's standards. It's not a boss that is going to swoop you off your feet, but it is still a boss that is really fun to carve into. A boss like Deacons of the Deep from Dark Souls 3 has the very same idea. Carve, slash, and tear your way through to the core and sink your teeth in for the kill. These two are very similar and share a lot of the same ideas. Phalanx wins out for me here because it's an interesting idea that FromSoft baked into the boss by having the boss get easier as the fight goes on. Continuously slicing through these blobs of goo exposes the weak point of this boss, which makes it easier. I find this fascinating as I can't think of too many modern FromSoftware bosses that get easier as the fight continues. Difficulty is completely subjective, so I'm sure you have an idea in mind, but the only one I could think of was Guardian Ape. Although Phalanx is just an okay boss. I can't experience the feelings and emotions someone may have had fighting this boss back in 2009, but fighting him today is just slashing through goo and there's not much else to it. 6 years after Demon Souls released, something very special came to life. That special something is Bloodborne, because of course it is. Bloodborne is still my favorite Souls game to date, but it has issues, mainly with bosses. A lot of base game bosses in Bloodborne simply are not that great. Bloodborne, in my opinion, has the best setting and atmosphere, and if you simply had more top tier bosses, it would be undefeated. So, you may be asking yourself, what the fuck does Bloodborne have to do with the Tower Knight, and why are you wasting my time? Well, I'm not trying to waste your time. If you have played Bloodborne, then this lead-up was not much of a surprise for you, as Bloodborne has the Tower Knight fight in that game, it's just called the One Reborn. Why this fight is so peculiar is because the One Reborn is a worse fight than what Tower Knight accomplished. It's not drastically worse by any means, but it doesn't do anything new, it doesn't push the needle. Both of these fights have the same formula. You take out the ranged enemies first, and wail on the boss afterwards. From Software didn't really try to evolve this gimmick fight in any meaningful way. I personally am all for fun callbacks to their past games, an Easter egg or two, but the one Reborn just feels like a tacked on boss fight. Some of this will most likely be talked about when we get around to Bloodborne, but make no mistake, Tower Knight did it better, Tower Knight is king. I guess one thing Bloodborne did slightly better, if memory serves me correctly, is the camera. The Tower Knight is one of the first overly large enemies that doesn't fully fit within your field of view. You can make the camera work in your favor by not locking onto a leg and bashing R1 on cooldown. But I can confidently say that players back in 2009 had no concept of using the camera as a multi-use tool, and not just a lock-on tool. I have to assume that the few that did play Demon Souls back then locked onto their targets at pretty much all times. Although I can't apply heavy criticism on Tower Knight because I don't think any of FromSoft's games have done a great job at teaching players how to utilize the camera to its full extent. Again, I have a hard time rating Demon Souls as I didn't play it when it came out on the PS3, so I can't rate it fairly. Back in 2009, I can assume this fight was kind of epic. By today's standards, it is pretty okay, and nothing more. The Armored Spider is a very straightforward fight to overcome. I mean that literally. When the fight starts, you have to earn the right to attack him by progressing forward if you accidentally made the mistake of choosing a melee build in Demon Souls. So realistically, dealing with the boss arena space is most of the challenge in this fight. When you are in melee range, his attacks don't do much of anything when it comes to damage. Since I am the worst player on this platform, you can see that I got hit by nearly every attack and I was able to shrug it off like nothing happened. His damage is quite low, making him just as easy as our other fights. This is probably a good thing for two reasons. Reason number one being how fucking awful Demon Souls runbacks are. Two, he has a move where he will spit out some sort of liquid, somehow, and he will ignite that liquid with a breath of fire, somehow. This heavily punishes melee builds since you will be fucking his face and you won't have enough stamina to reach the safe zone. His damage is so low and minuscule that it doesn't really matter since Demon Souls is just an easy game by today's standards. Meh boss and a meh level, which leads to a culmination of meh. The other Demon Souls bosses did a better job at playing into their gimmicks than what the Adjudicator was able to accomplish. There was at least some charm with our other fights, having to gain territory versus the spider or seeing your progress when you killed the Phalanx goo. These gimmicks aren't anything that will leave you with a longing for how well done they were, but they at least added character. Adjudicator's fight doesn't really have anything that makes him stand out besides looking so ridiculous with his floppy breasts and a bloated stomach. I can live without interesting artistic decisions, but his moveset also leaves a lot to be desired. I wasn't even reacting to his attacks. I didn't move nor dodge his attacks. His AI was just so poorly made that he never successfully attacked me. It got to the point where I asked myself if he was coded to detect the player character model, or was he just RNGing his attacks and they all just happened to miss me. It's a shame that our first boss of this level couldn't even come close to the quality of our level, as I really enjoy what was on offer here. This level does have 3 bosses, and he is without a doubt our weakest boss in the lineup. Even by Demon Souls standards, the Adjudicator feels like mini-boss quality, although I would still say he's better than something like Witches of Hemwick or Royal Rat Authority. He's at least a new model to view. How you handle the old hero's tempo is most of his gimmick. I don't even think that his gimmick is that interesting, and it could have had a lot more done with it. I have heard that the Thief Ring makes his fight even easier, but I usually don't care about minor macro knowledge in single-player games. Fighting him normally is just 2 bumbling idiots with a death wish. Since he is blind, the old hero will occasionally attack a spot where you aren't even located at. This leads to a boss that can be beaten by playing reactively instead of proactively and letting him make the mistakes while you punish what he decides to do. In a way, FromSoft didn't completely abandon this idea in my mind, as Millennia has the same idea with Waterfowl. As a melee player, most people will alter their playstyle to wait out Waterfowl and punish her after the burst of Waterfowl is done. They are somewhat similar, but I don't think either of them impress me with their execution. Gee, I'm already bitching about Waterfowl and we're 1 game in. I cannot wait to spew my hatred for that move when we get there. Up until Rykard in Elden Ring, I considered Storm King to be the best version of the Storm King gimmick boss fight that FromSoft has attempted. Admittedly, that's not that impressive, as Yorn the Giant is the same concept in Dark Souls 3, and he manages to be so boring that it's impressive. I definitely didn't need to take the extra step on this, but I did. I looked up footage of the PS3 Storm King boss fight to see how it looked, and I still think it looks just as cool. I did this to try and play fair. For all I know, this fight could have been slightly altered if I didn't see original gameplay footage, and the really good Bluepoint graphics make it better for me personally. This topic will be further elaborated when we get to Dark Souls 3, but Yorn is a pitiful Dark Souls 3 boss. He's a reused concept, less epic, with a terrible build-up due to his extremely short level and a boring-ass boss arena. Even if Storm King didn't have a grand build-up with the boss shooting projectiles at you throughout the level, he'd still be pretty good. But this is one of the extremely rare and even one-off cases where the level leading up to the boss makes killing these guys so much more mesmerizing on your first kill, since you get that build-up and lust for revenge. This is probably one of the rare instances where OG Demon Souls fans would prefer the PS5 version, since this fight is all about the spectacle and splendor of what's on your screen. Graphics here play hand in hand with that very idea. I am generally against most remakes nowadays, as we've all been burned by them once or twice, looking at you, The Last of Us remake, but I feel like the spectacle and scale here warrants the best graphical fidelity possible. So, this boss is better than the sum of its parts. Spectacle, scale, and mechanics, they come together neatly, making this a standout boss, especially for 2009. Storm King was the best boss of this type for 13 years until God Devouring Serpent took the crown in 2022. I found the level leading up to Fool's Idol to be a disappointment, and the boss is no better. Archstone 3 is probably the weakest Archstone in the game for me personally. The two bosses are bad and the levels aren't as interesting. Even for what Demon Souls was for its time, this boss most likely wasn't impressing many even back then. The gimmick is extremely obvious and there isn't enough variety in the gimmick itself. The whole fight will devolve into searching for the real boss so you can damage the health bar, and the whole cycle will rinse and repeat depending on how many times you need to do that cycle. There's also some really annoying traps on the ground that will stun lock you while the enemies attack you from a distance. Maybe I am blind and I am willing to accept that, but I don't see anything on the ground that would indicate that there's a trap on the floor. This boss is by no means memorable, and I forgot about her existence after my first playthrough. Leechmonger is a slightly better boss than our last boss, the Fool's Idol, but it's another lackluster Demon Souls boss that doesn't have much in terms of memorability. I don't even think his design is interesting to look at. He looks like a big humanoid blob that has a lot of clutter with his body falling off as he takes damage. This boss is one of the better examples of the mechanically interesting fights not being completely there yet. Demon Souls does have mechanically interesting fights, although they are very rare. Respectfully, they are bosses that are more suited for the endgame, which is respectable in its own right that FromSoft placed them later on and they knew most players wouldn't see them. But for what Leechmonger is, I don't think he has a lot going for him. I had to look back at my footage to spark my memory at what he did, and I noticed that he has a heal because I looked back at my kill. I think I was DPSing him so aggressively that I just didn't see it. The Dirty Colossus is another example of the mechanically interesting fights not working out until the mid-game with Demon Souls. There isn't a lot this boss does in terms of his moveset. He honestly feels like a worse version of Fuoko from Liza P. He even looks somewhat similar in form to me. I have counted the moves on this guy and I can pretty confidently say that he has less than 5. Even with the few moves he has, some of them overlap since he has a short stubby arm he attacks with. Even by Dark Souls 1 standards, this guy would be a poor mini-boss if you threw him into that game, which is pretty impressive when you can see the full picture of how FromSoft improved their craft so much in the span of 2 years. Dirty Colossus may not be the worst boss that I've ever fought, but he's one of the most forgettable. I can at least remember Beta Chaos for being fucking miserable. In a few months, I won't remember this guy at all. Archstone 5 can at least end on a high note with our Maiden. Unlike the last two bosses, this boss doesn't try to be mechanically interesting. Rather, FromSoft focused on making you feel emotional because of your actions. I'm sure fans of the story in Demon Souls appreciate it more than the gameplay-focused players like myself, but it's so strong that people that mainly care about gameplay can still take something out of it. If we remove Sekiro from the equation for a moment, Radon in Elden Ring is the only other time where I was invested into a story because FromSoft didn't try to hide it through their esoteric form of storytelling. Although, as I mentioned, I'm not much of a story expert in Demon Souls, so I'll let go of the narrative for now. The gimmick here does work, and Archstone 5 really needed this to not crown the definitive worst Archstone. Yes, fighting the knight that blocks our path is by no means interesting. I still respect that he's guarding what he seemingly vowed to protect. He won't even move from this general area here, which is probably a story element that FromSoft is presenting where he will act as a brick wall and won't let anyone to his maiden as long as he stands. Oh fuck, I guess the story is really good here and I have failed when I said I would stop talking about it. Well, to be fair, this fight is mainly a story-oriented fight. Anyway, I think this whole boss worked really well, and this is probably one of FromSoft's strongest story fights that they have ever set out to do. Flamelurker achieves what Demon Souls has long strived for but never quite hit the mark. He is a mechanically interesting fight that stands strong without relying on gimmicks. Even by today's standards, he's got some intriguing aspects that are worth discussing. While he isn't particularly challenging if you played at least one of the other Souls games, I'd still argue he's among the hardest in Demon Souls, perhaps even the hardest. The question of which boss truly claims that title could make for a really interesting gameplay analysis, especially when comparing how the difficulty of a challenging boss in Demon Souls stacks up against some of Elden Ring's over-the-top encounters. At the end of the day, Elden Ring is in the Demon Souls combat system after all. It's mainly just sped up and every weapon has an L2 ability, unlike Demon Souls. I know I kind of just boiled down Elden Ring's combat, it's more than that, but it is still Demon Souls. Something that I have noticed when I went back to Demon Souls is the enemy bosses could have had a 15% damage buff across the board, and that probably would have not been a bad balancing choice. You can have what feels like unlimited healing in this game anyway, so it's not like it would be a trade-off without any rhyme or reason. I say that because you can see in the gameplay footage here that I more or less turned my brain off and was able to tank my way through this encounter with minimal pushback. Flamelurker, while an okay boss by today's standards, is probably the epitome of why I can understand someone not liking this game in 2024. He's one of the better bosses in Demon Souls, and I still found him to warrant nothing more than a shoulder shrug from me. If you mainly play these games for the hard and cool bosses, Demon Souls has very little to offer for you, and that is probably why the playthrough that you are seeing will most likely be my last playthrough of Demon Souls ever. Our only dragon boss in Demon Souls can be easily summed up by saying FromSoft dropped the ball with Dragon God because they simply lacked the wherewithal to make an over-the-top epic dragon fight like we see in the modern games. A lot of the humanoid type enemies struggle to be interesting, so expecting a dragon in this game would have been a strenuous undertaking From Software would have had to do. Even if Miyazaki tried to fight for this boss to be worthwhile, I don't think he would have been given the resources as few had faith in this game's success. It's a shame because Dragon God looks pretty epic, and it would have been interesting to say Dragon God was the first cool dragon boss. Sadly, I cannot say that, as the only thing this boss has going for it is just looking cool. Dragon God's whole gimmick is to operate 2 harpoons to puncture his arms. Yes, you heard that right. Your entire goal is to puncture arms. Not something cool like his neck or face, his arms. When you shoot him the first time, he does an underwhelming slam on the device. He decides to not kill you while you're just standing there like a moron, and he decides to hit the harpoon. I have a higher tolerance for video game logic compared to the average person, but having the weapon aimed so precisely at him in his own boss arena is just stupid. This boss at least ends on a high note. Oh wait, no it doesn't, because you attack his chin that reminds me of Flexo from Futurama and then he just fucking vanishes. Dragon God is without a doubt a weak follow-up to one of the better bosses in Demon Souls. There are 2 issues I have with Elden Ring's duo bosses. Elden Ring shoves 2 enemies together with a boss health bar and says, "Go get him, Tiger," and it didn't work once in that entire fucking game. And 2, Elden Ring is such a hard game and the damage you take is so high in that game that doing Elden Ring's shitty bosses like Godskin Duo solo is just a miserable experience. Okay, so why am I talking about my Elden Ring critiques and not Maneater in Demon Souls? Well, I don't think that Maneater is a good duo boss by any stretch of the imagination, but I still respect these 2 more than any duo boss that is in Elden Ring. Duo bosses are some of my favorite bosses in From Software's games, and I've been bitching about how Elden Ring handled its duo bosses since the olden days of February 25th, 2022, the day Elden Ring launched. I can at least respect the Maneater boss fight for From Software giving it a try, although it's the kind of try where someone utterly fails at something, but hey, they tried and that's what matters most. If we need to have Maneater for FromSoft to make bosses such as Ornn and Smo or the Ring City Bats, then I'll gladly give this boss credit for originating the idea. The Maneater boss fight should really be called the Man-Eaters because I can't tell the difference if there even is one between these 2 enemies. They have the same model, and from reviewing my footage, they have the same moves. I don't really take much offense that these 2 don't have kits that flow together well because their moves are so limited that you can kind of just stomach whatever they throw at you. Demon Souls bosses also don't do a lot of damage when they attack you. Pile that on with the abundance of healing that is in this game, and you won't get that frustrated since there aren't overwhelming odds stacked against you. Although there is one thing stacked against you, and it's surprisingly not the camera, it's the boss arena. If you have played Demon Souls, then you may feel my pain here. This game isn't very hard if you are experienced with Souls, but whether you are a Souls veteran that tells everyone to get good because you are clearly the best Souls super gamer, or a new player, everyone will die to gravity at some point. And oh boy, this boss loves to knock me off the fucking boss arena. I had to restart the boss fight 3 times, yes, 3 miserable fucking runbacks. And 3 times I had to fight this piece of shit boss. One of the restarts wasn't even my fault as one of the Man-Eaters got stuck underground, but since he has wings, he clearly cannot die from the all-encompassing force of gravity. The other 2 times I died were due to the terrible ass boss arena. I mean, this just goes without saying, look how fucking awful this boss arena is. It tilts me just looking at it. I also looked at footage of the PS3 version of this fight, and I can say that that version looks way cooler, so I also don't get the luxury of that since Sony is a piece of shit. Thanks, Sony. My Maneater review is, don't bother. Do whatever you can to do these motherfuckers last because they suck. Old Monk is one of the few gimmick bosses in Demon's Souls that FromSoft has tried to recreate, but I don't think they've ever perfected the encounter. The obvious answer as to why this boss is almost impossible to perfect is because it's a PvP boss, and when you don't have someone that can be summoned to act as the boss, it dilutes down to a shitty and forgettable mini-boss. Dark Souls 3 did another attempt at this PvP style boss, and I don't think it was done much better there. In short, this idea is probably best left in the past, as it's going to feel like shit even if it is done well. I feel like most players would rather avoid PvP at all costs, as I have heard very few beg for solo host invasion to return in Elden Ring. The only way I can foresee this PvP style of boss working would be to give the invader an entire moveset that's different from what we're used to, as they would literally be the boss similar to Dead by Daylight or something. So now you can imagine that's why that idea isn't worth the development time to make something like that come to life. I honestly feel like we won't see another PvP style boss again, and I really don't think many care, including me. The boss design of Demon's Souls hits its peak at the very end of the game, and I would go as far to say that Demon's Souls has one of the stronger endings with its quality of bosses. Obviously, bosses like Penetrator aren't anything spectacular today, but if I try and judge this boss from the mindset of a 2009 boss, then I'd say he's really good, and our last boss is even better. Something FromSoft did really well with this boss is giving him one of the better cutscenes and closing out our story with the Fat Official. The Fat Official that gets penetrated by the Penetrator was the same Fat Official that called upon our demise during the Tower Knight boss fight. Fat Officials are something of a side villain in this game. It's very common for these enemies to be portrayed as pure, menacing evil, and seeing him get penetrated by the Penetrator was a fitting end to their story. It's just a shame that the PS3 Fat Official looks indefinitely better than the remake's Fat Official. Penetrator has a lot of the Souls ideas that are still a staple to this day. He's a cool knight with a cool moveset. It's simple and it always gets the job done. Just like most Demon's Souls bosses, his moveset isn't as appealing because of what we've seen today, but I find that he has a demanding aura that surrounds him. He's one of the few cases that looks better and more visually interesting in the remake. They went pretty far on how they changed him. His armor is a darker hue, and his sword is a blood red. I'd still rather they didn't change the original style, but I can live with what we were given. I like the Penetrator a lot. I think FromSoft did a really good job at making him the cool, badass knight that's a straight up 1v1 in this game. Demon's Souls has a few mechanically interesting bosses that work well to this day, but none of them are all that memorable because of how high the bar has been set by FromSoft's newer games. Old King Allant is the only boss in Demon's Souls that is still fun from a mechanical perspective. He does not have everything going for him, his boss cutscene is on the weaker side, but once you move past that and accept it for what it is, I think he's a really good boss. Bluepoint must have understood this as well because he looks identical to the PS3 version unlike some of the other enemies and bosses. Like Demon's Souls as a whole, he probably could have used a raw damage buff that he does to the player, but again, Demon's Souls is a different animal entirely. A final boss in a FromSoft game can be a lopsided mess on what it attempts to do. Something like Launch Elden Beast evoked feelings that FromSoft wouldn't want anyone to feel. I was sick of Elden Ring by the end, and Launch Elden Beast ended the game with a sour taste in my mouth. But something like Ishin tests the player on essentially every core mechanic that was in that game, and I would say that King Allant does one of the better jobs at being a skill check to beat the game. He has a lot of varied moves, especially for Demon's Souls standards. He also has one of the coolest moves in the entire fucking series, where he will literally drain your soul level. I completely forgot about this move, and I was so flabbergasted by that idea, and I can't recall this idea being done again. That may be for the better, as the newer games are astronomically harder than Demon's Souls, but that also may be a part of the charm of not having a game that is as hard as something like Elden Ring. Imagine if someone like Millennia drained your rune level each time she did the full screen arm charge when she throws you in the air. Even if that move is telegraphed, it would still be overly punishing. Playing through Demon's Souls, and specifically this boss, makes me wonder if FromSoft has any ideas they want to throw into the pot, but can't because it seems like they try to make the bosses harder and harder as the Souls combat goes on. I don't think Elden Ring introduced many new ideas that stuck in terms of boss design. That's not to bring up the age-old debate of Elden Ring's boss quality, because you can have a great set of bosses like Elden Ring, but I don't think they threw me off guard in a good way like how some of the older games accomplished. Pretty much every boss is a predictable two-phase boss with a lot of cool moves to interact with, but a game like Elden Ring doesn't have anything that I remember being so creative, even if it is just a stupid level drain like what Old King Allant has. To wrap up Old King Allant, I actually think he works really well as a final boss. He's not technically the final boss, but he does act as the last challenging boss, as his real form is more for story purposes. So since these two bosses are so closely related, I will quickly do King Allant here too. And I actually kind of like what they did. I don't think I would be as positive about this idea if From Software did it today. This game brings you to one final area to end the whole story. The area itself is enthralling for what it is, even if it is just one cinematic boss arena. King Allant isn't much of a final boss though. He's meant to be defeated with minimal effort. This is definitely baked into the story, I just don't care to analyze Demon Souls' story by this point. But I think that wraps up Demon Souls bosses, so let's do our final section and talk about the bosses as a whole and how they hold up by today's standards. Most of Demon Souls isn't really all that thrilling if you look at it with a modern eye. There's definitely some charm to that, especially if you care about seeing From Software's history. From someone like myself, I mainly pick up whatever tidbits of lore that I find naturally, so lore and story isn't something that matters a whole lot to me. And when you have my outlook on these types of games, they are without a doubt dated. A game like Fallout New Vegas is one of my favorite games ever made, but it is very dated, even more so than Demon Souls. But I still love that game to pieces. But unlike my love for Fallout New Vegas, I don't share that sentiment with Demon Souls. Demon Souls is, at its core, a system that was basic for its time and has been iterated on with each passing Souls game, meaning that most of From Software's games in the style feel alike, and you will eventually become spoiled with the modernized mechanics and speed. But even after saying all that, I think the bosses still somewhat hold up. In fact, I think the bosses in Demon Souls are stronger than the level design. That statement will be elucidated in the level video, but I can always find the charm in most of Demon Souls bosses, because a lot of them do have a gimmick for me to execute, and the few fights that From Software demanded a mechanically interesting fight, I think they succeeded in that venture. If anything, Demon Souls may represent an idea that should have never been shoved to the backline like it has today. And it's that FromSoft has these gimmick fights as a rarity nowadays. Shadow of the Erdtree would have really benefited from a true gimmick boss. I think you could use that gimmick boss as Commander Gaius without much needing to be changed. I always said that Gaius would have been a good gimmick boss if Torrent was buffed up, and Gaius was treated as someone who would put you in a medieval Joust of War theme. And I think Demon Souls knew its limits better than Dark Souls 1 or even 2. These two games have a lot of bosses that are trying to be mechanical fights but lack the complexity to make them an unforgettable boss. Of course, I am jumping ahead of myself with that statement, and that will be talked about during the Dark Souls 1 video, but I wouldn't change how Dark Souls 1's bosses were designed, just to be clear. So, do Demon Souls bosses hold up? For some people, yeah, definitely. For the group of players that want the over-the-top, super challenging bosses that will force them to optimize their build and struggle for hours, no, they do not.